Well, good morning, everybody. My name, as said, is Daniel Girdler, and I'm here this morning with my colleague, Dr. Sang-Won Soo, the president of Vital Metrics. And it's our very real pleasure, indeed, to be here at the summit. I feel like I've met most of you already at the summit, the Connect, last night. That was a great event. A lot of talking ensued. But those who I haven't met yet, certainly looking forward to seeing you through the remainder of the summit. We, as a company, are very pleased to be sponsoring this keynote conversation about bridging the distance between purchasers and on-the-ground consequences of purchasing decisions. In our work at Vital Metrics, we really focus on sustainability-related spend analysis. And that bridging, that information, that visualization and understanding of supply chain impacts, the delivery of that value and that data to clients is something we try to do every day. Really, as with the old adage, you can only manage what you can measure. That visibility really allows purchasers to prioritize and focus efforts on those areas within their supply chain that really warrant engaging with and need engaging with. And I should just say that there is still availability at the sustainability-related spend analysis short course, which is being run here on Friday. As with many of you, I'm sure, we've been in this space of sustainability-related purchasing, sustainable purchasing, for some time. And we are sensing a real sea change, really with regard to the attention that both public and private sectors are paying to this exciting and very material frontier of sustainable purchasing. As organizations are exploring what it means to be truly sustainable as an organization, sustainable as a business, issues of supply chain resiliency and efficiency are coming very strongly into play, as is an increasing awareness of and desire to grasp the commercial and the reputational risks and opportunities latent, at least temporarily latent, within their supply chains. And of course, all of these issues, more broadly speaking, are really issues of stewardship, as we all together grapple with what it means to be global citizens today. From our own work at Vital Metrics with the GSA, Google, and many other organizations, large and small, we are seeing an increasing desire to engage with these issues. And it's a desire which is entirely concurrent with the SPLC's drive toward and now delivery of guidance for leadership in sustainable purchasing. Now, central to that guidance, and indeed this summit, is Sam Hummel, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Sam as the host of today's keynote conversation. I'm sure, like many of you here today, I've gotten to know Sam quite intensely over the last few months, what with the release of the guidance and the excellent info webinars and pilot work that ensued. And I have to say, Sam's diligence in the delivery of these, and frankly his patient support, has been very much appreciated by us, and I'm sure by many of you. A brief bio of Sam as he comes to the stage. Sam is the SPLC's Director of Outreach and Operations, and he got his start in supply chain sustainability work in 1999 as part of a student-led effort to eliminate sweatshops from Duke University's apparel licensing. And as a sophomore, Sam took a semester off from school to work with a labor and human rights organization in Thailand. And that experience has really inspired and helped him understand and to bridge the gap between the technical conversations that were occurring in the university conference rooms and the actual experiences of the workers on the ground, the workers affected by those kinds of contracting decisions. Most importantly, Bridging the Gap confirmed for Sam that public interest advocates working on the ground, deep in the supply chains, have information and expertise that purchasers need. They need to be able to access that information if they wish to take responsibility for the social, environmental, and economic consequences of their purchasing decisions. In this keynote conversation that's about to take place, we're going to hear more stories of people working to bridge that gap between purchasing and the consequences of those purchasing decisions. So we hope you will hear the value that that work has produced for organizations throughout those supply chains, and the ideas about how we as members of SPLC can make that kind of work easier, more common, and more effective. So as we embark on what I am sure is going to be a valuable few days, a significant few days for us all, would you please join me in both thanking and welcoming Sam Hummel as he comes to introduce our keynote participants.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm joined here by a number of folks I'm going to introduce. We have here on my left, Christine Moody is the Chief Procurement Officer of the City of Portland, also a board member of the Sweat-Free Purchasing Consortium. The City of Portland passed the Sweat-Free Purchasing Ordinance in 2009, I think. And Sean Sellers, who's a senior investigator for the Fair Food Standards Council. I always mix up whether it's the Fair Food Program or the Fair Food Standards Council, which is the compliance monitoring organization for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Standards Program. And I do want to just note that Stephen Hightoff, who is the Chief Legal Counsel for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I owe a debt of gratitude for him for this conversation. He and I had a lot of conversations that helped shape this conversation, and he unfortunately wasn't able to join us today due to illness. We have Amy Smith, who is the manager of the wood sector engagement for the World Wildlife Fund, and she's part of the Global Forest and Trade Network North America team. And then we also have Dan Persica, who's the Sustainability Communications manager for Domtar Paper, which is a leader in the sustainable forestry world, and also is the brain trust behind the Domtar Paper Trail, a virtual tour of their supply chain. So before we get started here, I want to ask if we can get our slide roll going. So we've got some, this gap that we're trying to bridge today between what's happening on the ground and then these technical conversations about how do we do sustainable purchasing. We've got some photos that are going to be up here in just a second, I think, showing some of the things that are happening on the ground. But to get us started, there we are, some forests. To get us started, I want to ask we have a social environmental advocate here in WWF, and Amy, and we have, environmental and social. Both. Yeah. And also social and environmental both, I would say, with Sean. Can you just lead us off, and I'll start with you, Amy, by trying to sort of tell us what's the problem that your organization was trying to address that led you to be doing supply chain work?
Sure. Well, World Wildlife Fund works on a number of different commodity issues. I happen to focus on timber, pulp, and paper as part of the Global Forest and Trade Network. And we work to sustain forests so that they benefit wildlife and people. And as we know, forests are vital to life on Earth. They purify the air we breathe, they filter the water we drink, they prevent erosion and sedimentation, they are home to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, and of course they produce all of these products that we use on a daily basis. Our furniture, flooring, construction materials, paper, and they're disappearing at an alarming rate. It's estimated that we lose about 32 million acres of forest every year. That is about 48 football fields per minute. So it's a significant amount of forests that are being lost. And the drivers of this deforestation are varied. One of the largest drivers is agriculture, cattle ranching, Also illegal and unsustainable logging, and that results in forest degradation, which is also of concern. So if we're talking about deforestation as the outright loss of forest, forest degradation is a loss in forest quality. And it has impacts on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and also on the world's climate. So we're working to tackle deforestation and forest degradation. And fortunately, we see that there are solutions, including responsible forestry and trade practices.
What's the problem you're trying to solve?
The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a worker-based human rights organization headquartered in Southwest Florida. They were formed about 20 years ago by workers who were attempting to address and really confront the conditions that they faced. So, as many of you know, the majority of fruits and vegetables that we consume in the United States are still hand harvested. That will be the case for the foreseeable future. And workers in the agricultural industry face some of the lowest wages and most dangerous and abusive working conditions that this country has to offer. Specifically in Florida, where the tomato industry is a big player, workers had been facing stagnant wages since the late 1970s, which meant in real terms, wages had been cut nearly in half. Wage theft, sexual harassment, physical violence were all rampant in the day-to-day conditions that workers faced. And in the extreme, workers were actually held against their will in situations of modern-day slavery. So this would be with the actual use of violence or the threat of violence. The CIW has worked with the Department of Justice to prosecute now 7 such cases, forced labor operations in the Florida agricultural industry. The most recent, in 2007, involved over a dozen workers who were being chained up at night, locked up inside a box truck, and forced to work for no pay in the tomato industry.
So I didn't know some of those things that were happening out there in these supply chains. And it's always been, as I've encountered public interest groups in this work, very interesting to learn. And I know I think for many of us here, it is a learning process, and we'll talk about that. So this conversation about bridging the gap between what's happening out there, what we just heard about, and then our procurement decisions where we're shuffling paper and doing contracts and so forth, is a real challenging one for purchasers who are trying to take responsibility for what's happening in their supply chain, because getting visibility past their tier 1 suppliers can be extremely challenging, and then even knowing what to do with that information if you can get it. Many times the impacts we're talking about here are far out in the supply chain for many of our end-use buyers, that they don't have a lot of leverage once they get out that far in the supply chain. So how do you actually even use that information? And then for your public interest advocates, they're on the ground. A lot of the times the organizations that they're working with, who are really there on the ground, say we don't have the leverage over the conditions. We're being pressured by the end-use buyers, and we have to cut these social and environmental corners to get by, and that's how they find themselves, needing to bridge that gap and find their way to the conversations that we're having here today. And the thesis of the conversation today is that there are more effective ways to do that than others, and that if we can work together within SPLC as a leadership community to identify how that happens well, how it can happen more, that we can be together a much more effective movement to create sustainability in our global economy. So one of the things that, that was the thesis of this conversation, and when I had conversations with each of these folks up here, they really did confirm that. There definitely are better ways to do this than others. And something that was interesting that came out of that was this progression. Each of them have worked on many different issues of their careers, and I saw that there's sort of a progression that these things go through. So first of all, there's the education phase, where you have, in many cases, a public interest advocates trying to figure out how do we make the buyers aware of what's happening. And there are better ways to do that, and we'll talk about that. And then there are buyers who are saying, how do I get educated about what's happening out in my supply chain? So that's the education phase. And then you've got the pioneer phase. The pioneer phase is when you say, okay, we've got some information now, but what do we do with it? there isn't yet a mechanism for how to actually take that information and use it in buying decisions. And so that's the pioneer phase. People are cutting their way through the jungle trying to figure out how do we do something here. And then there's what I call the mechanism formalization stage, which is when in that pioneer stage, buyers, suppliers, public interest advocates have come together and identified a mechanism that works. They formalize it. And then there's the market transformation phase. And that's where, how do we get this mechanism adopted by enough people in the marketplace to transform the marketplace? So we're going to sort of walk through those phases and explore them with the real stories from you. So let me start with Christine on that education phase. When we talked to you, you had a lot of thoughts about what it's like to have public interest advocates come to you and want to educate you about things that are happening in supply chains and better ways to do that.
So yes, I think at the City of Portland, we have several different policies and resolutions that have to do with different things in the supply chain about sustainability and best business practices. And over the years, we've been approached by different groups that have an interest in our city council passing a resolution that has to do with what they're interested in. And what I think we've found is actually, if you're coming into an agency, is you're viewing this as a partnership, and it truly is an education. We've most recently been approached about sourcing conflict-free minerals. And that's something that a year and a half ago I didn't know anything about. The group that has approached us has been very willing to sit down and educate us and understand that we want to do the right thing, but we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. And so they've approached us with written materials. We actually we're fortunate enough in Portland a few months ago, there was a art exhibit that had to do with the Congo and conflict-free sourcing there. And so that just happened to be in our backyard, and we went and took a tour there. And it was a visual education for us that I think was very helpful. And so kind of viewing this as a partnership, and that in very beginning phase, understanding that if you're coming to our office, we're purchasers, and so we know how to buy things. We're not necessarily ingrained in whatever your organization is advocating for. And so educating us, and then oftentimes we're finding things where we are on the cutting edge, and so then sticking with us and helping us figure out how to implement and actually make that end result different.
And Amy, let me ask you, I know, and Dan, you as well, that the educational process has been a really important part of your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the Global Forest and Trade Network, or GFTN, is a program that's been around for more than 20 years now, and we're focused on promoting responsible forestry and trade. And we do that by working in 27 countries. So we're working in important sourcing countries with forest managers and manufacturers in places like Russia, China, Indonesia, Peru, Gabon, the Congo, and other Congo Basin countries. And we're working with buyers in places here in the US, Europe, Australia, to help them to source more responsible forest products. And a lot of our work is education. So it's helping forest managers and manufacturers to move towards more responsible forestry practices and chain of custody, credible certification. Forest Stewardship Council certification is the one that we feel is the most robust, and WWF has done a lot of analysis of the different forest certification schemes out there. So we do a lot of technical assistance and training for forest managers and manufacturers, and also for buyers here in the US and elsewhere, helping them to understand what some of the risks are of sourcing from certain places or certain species, and how they can mitigate those risks. And a big part of that is sourcing more FSC material and recycled content as well.
So you've learned to speak the language of risk management, and which the procurement people know well.
And I was going to add that as far as educating the purchasers who may be 2 or 3 steps down the supply chain from the on-the-ground impacts, the best way to do that and show them the on-the-ground impacts is to show them the on-the-ground impacts. So one of the things that Domtar does is host mill and forestry tours, of which Amy has been on a few. And that's where we actually give buyers and purchasers that experience of flying into a small regional airport, taking a van down some dusty rural road to get to a parcel and see actual forest that may be harvested, and that fiber sent to a mill where that purchaser buys from. And you can't really substitute speaking to the small landowner who owns that forestry, hearing, straight from his own mouth how important stewardship is to him, how that parcel, how that forest might have been in his family for generations, and how he's proud to work with a company that shares those values. And so, and it also cuts both ways. I think we found that whereas it helps to illustrate for purchasers maybe where the supply chain starts and what the on-the-ground impacts are, we've also used that experience, as Amy can attest to use large corporate end users to demonstrate to small landowners who may be wary of certification that there actually is a market for this. There is an end use, and they should go through the rigorous process of achieving certification because they will have an outlet for their fiber. So it's a way to bring the supply chain to life.
So there's speaking the language, there's getting people visually, viscerally, connected with the issue. And then there's also one thing that came out, which is you've got to be educating the right people. So, Sean, talk a little bit about the history of Coalition of Immokalee work.
Sure. When the Coalition of Immokalee Workers began its organizing in the early to mid-90s, the worldview was really one where there were workers, there were crew leaders, which are the field level supervisors, and there are growers. And so for the first several years of the organization's existence, it focused its efforts on pressuring those growers to improve wages and improve conditions. And by and large, that effort, while it was successful in preventing additional wage cuts, it did not yield the gains that the workers were seeking. So the big breakthrough for the CIW came around 2000, and that's when they began to realize that the tomatoes that were being hauled out of Immokalee and other agricultural towns in South Florida, they were destined, for a large market. And in fact, ever larger, highly consolidated buyers of tomatoes were playing a crucial role in that market. They were leveraging their buying power to drive down prices. And so the CIW began to realize that growers were actually caught in a bit of a vice. And on the one hand, they were facing a falling price for their product at the farm gate. And on the other hand, the growers were facing rising input costs, whether for seed, fertilizer, farm equipment, land, what have you. And from the grower's perspective, the one place where they could maintain some element of profitability, some margin, was their labor costs. And so that breakthrough in analysis really changed the frame. And the struggle went from being rather provincial to being part of an international food system. And so the CIW began to focus on the end buyers. Initially, it was Taco Bell. There was a 4-year boycott of that company. And in doing so, that also opened the door for the CIW to connect with consumers. And at that time, in particular, young people who were the target market of Taco Bell, 18 to 24-year-olds. So that change in perspective really did open a lot of doors for the CIW. And that's eventually what led to the creation of the Fair Food Program.
So then we go from the education phase into the pioneer phase, and that's where things like promoting transparency, just trying to get the information and then figure out how to use it. Amy, talk a little bit about how GFTN started with the buyer group and grew from
Sure,
there.
yeah. So back in '91, GFTN started really as a group of buyers, of retailers in the UK that were committed to sourcing products from well-managed forests. And they were instrumental, they played a part in forming the FSC a couple of years later. And then they really became what was formerly known as GFTN today. Over time, we realized that we needed to be working at all levels of the wood and paper supply chain. So we began to work with forest managers, manufacturers, end users, retailers, all along the line. And that's how the program evolved. And specifically, you're asking about transparency, and I think that's something that certainly, we're working with about 200 companies globally at this point, and it's something we encourage of all of our GFTN participants to be transparent. And I think we also learn through our process that it's equally important as an NGO to be transparent about the work we're doing with companies on responsible sourcing.
And Christine, you were telling me about the HPD, the Healthy Product Declaration group, when they came to talk to you. Talk about the value of a group recognizing that they're in the pioneer phase.
I think there was a lot of value there because it was us heading into something as a partnership. So the HPD form is kind of what we call a MSDS sheet on steroids. So it's a full disclosure of everything that's in the products, or if you're designing a building. And when the Oregon Environmental Council came to us and wanted our city council to pass a resolution, and they were very upfront about that they want us to start using this and start speccing out that we're going to request the HPD form for our products. But it was not actually adopted in a final form yet. And so I think that was very helpful for us to kind of just, again, back on the education, is to say, okay, we know where we're at. We know that it's not finally adopted. We understand what it looks like. And they were very helpful in allowing us to kind of weed through that a little bit. And you know, they've continued to, even after we passed our Healthy Products Initiative, have continued to be engaged with us as this is an ever-changing market and things are coming on new. They're kind of our resource into what's continuing to come up. And so I think, you know, I really view that as a partnership, and there's a lot of conversation about, okay, here's what's new, and if we run into something and we're having some problems with implementing, we can look at them as a resource, as a technical expert to help us along.
And so then let's move into the mechanism formalization phase. And you know, there are a number of aspects that came out in my conversations with you all. One of them was that, you know, the mechanism has to be compatible with procurement. A lot of organizations will show up on your doorstep and want you to do things that aren't compatible with procurement. Can you talk a little bit about that, Christine?
Yeah, I think, again, it's an education back and forth, depending on what organization you're in and what state you're in. You have different procurement law. We were kind of talking about it backstage. So in Oregon, we have the opportunity to do best value contracting. And so that's where we can do things other than just the low bid, and we can give preference points for social or environmental type of impacts or business practices. And so that's something that, you know, maybe most people might not know, but it's an education back from our standpoint to say here's our restraints, here's some opportunities, and kind of talk through that a little bit more and see if that's a different way that we can buy things, or if there are things nationally, like we were talking about certifications. Buyers love certifications, a third-party certification. It is very easy for us to then know that companies have been vetted, that there is a nationally recognized certification, and it's easy for us to then spec that out in our procurement specifications, or again, do a preference for that. So, you know, there's just different industries are further along than others, but I think that is one key that does make things easier for us as public procurement officials.
And then, Sean, when we were talking, you were saying that it's really important that the mechanism be one that's binding, that suppliers and public advocates and everybody know that the demand is going to respond to the information coming from the ground. Talk about that.
Yeah, the reason the Fair Food Program has been so effective, and it has been effective, the Florida tomato industry is widely recognized as moving from the worst working environment in U.S. agriculture to the best working environment in U.S. agriculture, and that happened in just 3 years. I mean, that's a remarkable transformation for an industry that was plagued with abuses for decades. But that would not have happened were it not for the binding agreements that are at the heart of the Fair Food Program. In particular, binding agreements between the CIW, the worker organization, and the participating buyers in the program, which range from now Taco Bell, McDonald's, all the way to Walmart and Whole Foods. There are 13 buyers in the program, and new buyers are coming in all the time. And so what those binding agreements obligate buyers to do are two things. The buyers pay an additional premium on those tomatoes, which go to improve workers' wages, and at the Fair Food Standards Council, we audit that to make sure it's passed through the supply chain and paid out to workers. But perhaps more importantly, those agreements obligate the buyers to only purchase from growers who are in good standing as determined by the Fair Food Standards Council. So we conduct very intensive auditing. Our sample size for worker interviews is 50%. So if there are 900 workers at a farm, we'll speak with 450 of them. We also, out of the Fair Food Standards Council, operate a 24/7 worker complaint hotline. It's staffed by those same auditors. We're all bilingual. So the point being, there's a lot of sources of credible information flowing from the program, and the Fair Food Standards Council determines if a grower is in good standing or not. At the point that a grower is placed on suspension, those buyers are legally obligated to shift their purchases, and they have a reasonable time frame to do so, but that market enforcement is the only reason that this program works. If it was just up to voluntary compliance, there would be no change to speak of.
And in fact, you know that because that happened. Right?
We do know that because it happened. Prior to the Fair Food Program, the industry itself tried to create a sort of code of conduct monitoring scheme called Socially Accountable Farm Employers that was predicated purely on voluntary compliance as well as the industry monitoring itself. At the same time that that was happening, we know for a fact that slavery operations were continuing to exist. The worst forms of abuses were continuing to exist. So it was really this shift to a binding type of system that is what has made the transformation possible.
It's really remarkable that when they had the first grower get cut off because of the binding agreement, once they had the first grower sign on, I think it was 2 months or 3 months by the time 90% of the market was signed on.
Yeah, when the dominoes began to fall in the tomato industry and growers began to join, it really did go pretty quickly. So we had the first grower agree to implement the program in September of 2010, and by November, 90% of Florida tomatoes production was covered.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And the White House, New York Times, it's really hailed as one of the biggest human rights success stories in recent history. And it's expanding. And so let's go ahead and go on to the expanding the program. You mentioned some of the retailers, but you also have major food service companies. And I understand Compass Group, one of the largest food service companies in the world, made an announcement recently that they are going to buy whatever crop you go into next. They're only going to buy Fair Food Standards Council.
Yeah, that's correct. Aramark, Sodexo, and Compass Group, as well as Bon Appetit, are all participating buyers in the program. Compass Group did announce on Earth Day they will be expanding the program to additional crops in additional states. And as per the agreement with Walmart, who entered the program in January of last year, we will, starting this summer, be expanding to cover tomato farms from Florida up the East Coast as far north as New Jersey. And this fall, we will be launching a pilot project in a second crop in Florida. So it's exciting to see that the program's on the move.
So one more thing about the formalizing the mechanism that all of you talked about was that a good mechanism that can make this information useful in procurement adds value along the entire supply chain. You all talked about that. Why don't we start with you, Amy, and then Dan, and we'll see if we can get a couple more comments.
Well, I think in terms of responsible forestry practices, I've mentioned FSC, and I think that has been very effective. What I also mentioned in my initial remarks was about the impacts of forest degradation. And actually, WWF did an analysis a few years ago called the Living Forest Report, and we looked at different land use scenarios, assuming we're going to have an increase in population up to 9 billion by 2050. How do we reach our goal of zero net deforestation and forest degradation by 2020 and maintain that? What can we do? Well, if we continue on a business as usual scenario, we're in trouble. But the good news is there are certain suite of activities that we can apply to actually achieve that goal. And there's a role for plantations on degraded lands, there's reducing wasteful consumption, using recycled material, and increasing the number of acres under responsible forest management. And the best way to ensure that forests are under responsible forest management is under FSC. So I think that actually provides value to the forest so that they remain standing and that they aren't converted to other uses.
Dan, as a supplier in that supply chain, how does it add value for you?
So, speaking of adding value, like you said, we mentioned certification and other things. I think when you mentioned implement, if it had to be implementable. So, on my earlier remarks about, mill visits and forestry tours, we know that's not realistic for everyone. Not everyone can just take a plane out to Johnsonburg, Pennsylvania and go to a mill, nor could we do that all day with all of our customers. So one way that we've worked to leverage technology and kind of make that more implementable and open the transparency is with a site that you mentioned earlier called the Paper Trail. So we could have buyers, everyone from a self-employed individual that works out of their home, buys one ream of paper a week, to the large corporate end user who buys by the truckload, can enter that order online, day or night, get the estimated economic or environmental impacts associated with producing that order. And that's kind of standard stuff we see on surveyation questionnaires, almost in a more easy to digest format. But what really makes that kind of, down the transparency theme that we talked about is that Paper Trail will give not only that impact information we're usually asked about, it'll give information we were not often asked about. So for Johnsonburg, for example, I noticed in the pre-reading that the Bell Harbor had like a waste diversion rate of 70% last year. So users who use the Paper Trail and get their product out of Johnsonburg will note that mill had waste diversion of 97% last year. So that's kind of what they're doing well. But they'll also hear the story of what they're working on, which is that Johnsonburg's greenhouse gas emissions are slightly higher than the industry average, and that's because they pull power from western Pennsylvania, which is largely fossil fuels. So it's given them kind of a deeper delve into their supply chain. It's a little more easy to do that than maybe take a flight out to Johnsonburg every week. But we feel that transparency is something that's got to be implementable, it's got to be useful for the end user, it's got to be the language they speak, and easy to access as well. And that's one way we go about doing that.
And the unexpected benefit for your sales team and your staff you were telling me about.
Yeah, so another large addition to the recent update of the Paper Trail was we put an equally as large focus on social and economic impacts as environmental. People have the tendency to go to environmental whenever you talk about sustainability, but when we really got into the the social sustainability, you kind of saw something click with the sales guys who know the product inside and out. But when they, had this sense of pride of, this product stemming from a responsible North American manufacturer, from seeing all the good things we do, volunteer efforts, charitable causes, the economic engine that we actually have in many of these rural communities, it kind of gives them, something, an extra feel good that they can feel good about. So it's something that wasn't really expected, but not really the target market of the initial site, but it's something that's resonated with even internally as well as externally for our customers.
And Sean, I wanted to ask you about that one as well, but I've lost my question. Did you have it?
Sure. We have seen benefits to the program that have extended beyond the workers and beyond the buyers. Obviously, the buyers get the risk prevention, risk management, reputational protection that comes with participating in the program. But participating growers have seen severe reduction or significant reductions in workforce turnover. They're becoming employers of choice. And this is very important as the Florida agriculture industry may just be another construction boom away from real labor shortages. So if you're in that industry, you want to be one of the growers that workers are vying to work for.
And also the floor, the price floor.
Yeah, we have heard anecdotally that participating growers in the program do at times receive an additional de facto premium in the market since their participating product is of limited supply. So that's been a benefit as well. And we've actually seen that pull growers into the program.
So one other thing that we want to talk about is market adoption. So you've got a mechanism now. How do you spread it beyond? What does it have to do to be able to spread? And so let's hear, Christine, for you all to take up a mechanism, a new mechanism, and make it part of your procurement, what does it have to do for you?
I think, again, it's what we were just talking about, just at the end, adding value to, as a government agency, we're responsible to the citizens and the taxpayers, and so adding value to them and what the citizens, for us in particular, the city of Portland, want to see. And so we have pretty aggressive social and sustainability policies and practices, and that's what our citizens have told us. And so for us to kind of work on this stuff and be able to show them that what we are working on is providing value back to them is what our goal is.
Absolutely. And let me put this question to all of you, which is, so SPLC is a leadership community of practice, the public interest, suppliers and buyers. How can SPLC help make this happen more often, in more commodities, more effectively? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can speak very briefly and just say I think part of it is actually just the value of convenings such as these, where these stories and perspectives can be exchanged. But I think also having rigorous analysis for what the different schemes are that are out there. Voluntary adoption is an important metric of success for I think a lot of programs, but I would just challenge people to make sure that programs deliver what they actually claim to deliver, because there is snake oil out there in the world, and it should people should be skeptical of it, rightfully so.
So I would agree with what Sean said. I think that what's happening here, these types of gatherings are really effective. Certainly the work that's happening with the tags to put together the guidance and the rating system, having a diverse group of stakeholders providing input that can give that analysis that's needed to put forth something that is truly leadership. I think everything's headed in the right direction.
And I would agree with Amy. I think diverse stakeholder engagement is critical. I mean, if it's going to be sustainable long term, you're going to have the insight and input from different stakeholders. So that's certainly a key thing for SPLC.
And lastly, I think for a purchaser standpoint, it gives us a place to go to learn more and to hear what's going on in the industry, because we need to be aware of what is going on in the industry for us to put together our procurements and contracts.
So thank you all. I just want you to know we had hours and hours of amazing discussion on this. There's so much here about how to do this really well and to do it in a systematic way. And I hope that you're excited about the opportunity within the SPLC community to learn from these things and make it go far and fast, so that we're getting the whole economy a lot sooner than might seem possible now. So thank you all for participating. And
Thank you.